Hello, YouTube. This is Chrisiosity. How are you? I am, to be honest, getting over a bad case of bronchitis that left me having a lot of difficulty talking for the first half of the month. And it's still there. You can still hear it. So I guess it's just going to be one of those things that lingers. So I'm going to just have to try to fight through it. Otherwise, I won't be able to do a video for this month, and I have some real plans of things I want to get out there and I want to do. So I'm just going to push through, and I'm sorry if it sounds kind of wonky. Anyway, so if you watch this channel, then you no doubt have heard the phrase toxic masculinity thrown around once or twice, and maybe you've come across some objections or concerns raised as well. So today we're going to do a deep dive into this topic from the very beginning. Well, here's where we have to talk about something called the men's mythopoetic movement that went on through the 80s and 90s and technically is still around, though smaller and preferring a more under-the-radar sort of approach at this point. The movement came to prominence when poet Robert Bly wrote the book Iron John, a book about men, which spent 62 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list back in the 80s. Iron John deconstructed one of Grimm's fairy tales about a young prince who frees a wild, hairy, iron-skinned man from a cage and begins a period of initiation into adulthood with the man as mentor and helper. Bly looked at this story through the lens of Jungian analysis and archetypes and talked a lot about the grief and confusion men felt in the modern age when traditional ideas of masculinity aren't working anymore. And the role of men as men in the world is really not clear. Men who were inspired by these kind of ideas and thoughts would do things like take weekend retreats into the wilderness with other men, and there would be drumming and reciting poetry and talking about their dads and such.
I was always much smaller than all the other boys in my classes growing up. I tended to be bullied, and the solution that my parents came up with was that I should be taught how to fight, and so that I can defend myself. And that actually did work for me. It made me feel good. I did enjoy for that time that kind of feeling of dominance that you have over someone whenever you overcome them physically. And so in that way, I think early on I did participate in some toxic behaviors and didn't address insecurities that I had about myself, and instead dealt with them through violence. And I think that, as I got older, that became less of a thing for me. I saw that wasn't the way to deal with things, but created a set of insecurities in me that I had to go back to later and try to deal with, because they manifested themselves in other areas of my life, and they're things I'll probably always have to deal with in some respect.
And in terms of my father was, I'm 67, and my dad was in his 40s when I was born. He was of this generation of men that were quiet and uncommunicative and stern, and he'd had a hard life, and we had almost nothing in common. And although I always felt that I couldn't please him, and that was a part of my issue with the whole man thing, because it seemed like a suicide mission to try to achieve some sketchy ideal that I wasn't good at anyway.
One of them was definitely like over-identifying with masculinity to the point where it's like I'm trying not to be a bad man. I'm trying not to do the toxic things, but at the same time I was trying to pigeonhole myself in masculinity, and I think my dad was a little bit more woke than even he realized by saying that he had his feminine side, which was probably one of the positive things to come out of these kinds of books that we are reading right now in the 90s. And but it was still kind of compartmentalized. You still have to be 70% masculine and only 30% feminine. You can wear a pink t-shirt to prove how masculine you are, but you got to be that 70% masculine, 30% feminine at least, right? And that was, I think, something that I never really thought very critically about for most of my life. '90s geese are crazy. It's all that MTV you're listening to.
Unprotected sex all the time.
Unprotected sex. Pugs. Hawks? Pug? What's the game called?
Pogs.
Pogs! Well, after this, I'd like to go play some Pogs. But anyways, I get
got some on.
Do you really? Well, I guess it's your turn to talk.
When I went to school, it was more like girls did the art class and boys did like math. And so I started to over-identify with being mathy or sciencey or part of the STEM community to the point where I would abandon my creative influences. And so that kind of pushed me into wanting to be right all the time, because I thought there was an objective way to be right, being in that math system where there's one correct outcome. And I think that soured a lot of the relationships I had with other people, wanting to be correct. And so that's basically what I've got. Eventually, I feel like I have come around and I've been able to talk about literature and art and music, and kind of abandon that, math, there is a place for it, but it's not like this empirical system that governs the universe.
I grew up in the backwash of second wave feminism, right into the buzzsaw I walked into. And one of the most direct shocks of my life was when Monica, let's call her, at university, came out of the closet after Brian killed himself, fellow student. This is what's known as a stressor. And she approached me one day and said, Kenneth, I have something important to tell you. Don't go out with men. Well, I felt like the bottom dropped out of my soul, but I figured there's enough grief in the world. So I wished her well. And she said I was important enough to know, and I reminded her of him. And then she dropped out of my life. So where was all this patriarchal power? I had none of it. Those few words. You were important enough to know and remind me of him. It's like Philip K. Dick said, everyone has a short sequence of words that can destroy you. Not that she was a lesbian, whatever floats your boat. But that was the phrase. So I worked through a lot of anger and a lot of grief because of that. I was very misogynistic for a while, as in, where are all these goddamn fucking cunts whom I'm supposed to have and oppressed? It seemed to be a given that I'm a bad guy because I'm a guy. I didn't even have social skills back then. Pimply, severely deaf nerd. So that said, that was many moons ago, and third wave feminism, roller derby and so on, is a lot more fun. And it's a lot healthier for all parties involved.
Now, all this might sound Jordan Peterson-esque, but that would be unfair. Bly was, and I don't know how to say this nicely, so I'm just going to say it, he was a lot smarter than Jordan Peterson was, and his work much more nuanced and complex, and I'm not endorsing anyone's ideas here necessarily, but I would consider Bly's a very different thing. For one thing, he spent as much time honoring feminine archetypes as he did masculine ones, and he would never have put them into such reductive categorizations as chaos and order. Now, while Bly did endorse certain traditional ideas of masculinity, he did not endorse patriarchy. It's interesting to note that he called patriarchal notions, like the ones that Peterson might have, Herod energy, and claimed that they always resulted in attacks on young people, particularly those who didn't fit established modes. Interesting in the sense that this is exactly what we've seen from Peterson and others who have made college kids into their other. Bly also talked about how the grief of men, when not dealt with, would lead to the rise of fascist fathers as political leaders. Another figure in this movement, though less prominent, was a man named Shepherd Bliss, and he's the one who coined the term toxic masculinity, which he contrasted with deep masculinity. He first talked about this in his doctoral dissertation. That I couldn't get my hands on, unfortunately. What I was able to procure was this book, The Politics of Manhood. Pro-feminist men respond to the mythopoetic men's movement and the mythopoetic leader's answer from 1995. I'm going to have some lovely people read some excerpts on what Bliss's approach to masculinity was in general, and then what he said about toxic versus deep masculinity.
There are many masculinities. Masculinity is not singular or monolithic. Masculinity varies from man to man, from family to family, and from culture to culture. Masculinity is learned behavior and as such can be changed. Masculinities are made, not born. They become rather than are. Masculinities emerge. They are processes rather than events, dynamic rather than static. I do believe that archetypes influence our behavior, but I also believe in social construction of reality. It is not an either-or. You can have both and, unless you're a fundamentalist.
Okay, so what we can glean from this is that he thinks there's a lot of play in the concept of masculinity, though he also believes it's attached to manhood. Notice he says it changes from man to man, not woman to woman or anyone else. And also that some archetypal images influence it, and he often specifically references certain ones like Kokopelli or Orpheus, or more generally like the Good Father.
Healthy masculinity does many wonderful things. Father children, fight fires, harvest food, love the feminine, write poetry, play music. These qualities contribute to what Bly calls the deep masculine. It is generative, earthy, nurturing, playful, forceful, and zany. The deep masculine lies at the base of each man. The deep masculine is within him, and within the legacy of positive male ancestors who have gone before and taken responsibility for families, tribes, villages, and entire peoples. It interacts with historical reality and can emerge or be repressed. Earthy masculinity does not have time to waste bickering, snickering, and being sarcastic, snide, mocking, and putting down. We must reassociate ourselves with nature, getting back to animals, plants, and nature itself.
Toxic masculinity poisons through means such as neglect, abuse, and violence. Toxic masculinity can wound and even be fatal to men, women, children, and the earth. Toxic behaviours can be accumulated in a sexist society. They are not essential and inherent, but they can become addictive. Men are not essentially bad. Boys are born loving. We are witnessing the destructuring of traditional masculinity. I welcome this dissolution, confusing and painful as it is for many men and women. I am tired of male violence in the forms of rape, abuse, neglect and competition. I am tired of men dying 8 years younger than women. I am ready for change.
Now, I feel the need to say here that I have made Bliss's work into something better than it is. I have been through his articles and his writings and pulled the wheat from the chaff. And there's a lot of chaff, but there's also wheat there to be found, in my opinion. And I've tried to distill it out of a lot of what I see as, self-indulgent New Age prattle, defensive whining, and refusing to speak directly to critiques, a lot of time complaining about the prominence of Bly, lecturing paternalistically to women and feminists, and contradictory takes on gender essentialism that never really get resolved. You could certainly read more of his stuff if you find this interesting, though it takes some doing to get some of it. I got a used book off of Amazon. You can pretty easily find stuff by Robert Bly. What I have done here is, I hope, present the most charitable and concise explanation of where these terms came from and what the men who originally conceived of them were about. I'm not trying to sell you on them, just explain them and present them with accuracy. All right, well, I've told this story before on this channel, but I'm going to start out with this. When I was a kid, I lived in this sort of working class area where there were a lot of like side-by-side duplex apartments. They kind of went in a line, and then the back area was communally used by all the people, if that makes sense. So there are a lot of working class people living in close proximity and sharing a space, basically. There was a family that lived close to us, like 2 families over. And let's call them the Smiths, I guess. I don't know. And the father was a terrible asshole. He used to take he had 2 boys and 2 girls, and he would take the boys out in the back lot area, and he would throw the football around to them. But what he would do is he'd take the football and he'd throw it way up over their heads. Like they'd have to jump 8 feet high to catch these things. And of course they couldn't. And they'd run after it as fast as they could, and he'd be shouting at them that they were pussies and pansies and you're like a girl and what are you doing and blah, just a dick. Just an abusive, bullying prick. So his oldest boy was the same age as I am, and he became a terrible bully himself. No one will be that surprised. At some point, I was a very nerdy and small person. I was just like, I don't know, magnet for bullies. Like, I just liked to sit around and read and was kind of shy and that sort of thing. So he used to bully me quite a bit, and I would just avoid him. And one day I was cutting through the back area because I was trying to actually avoid, it was like a wooded area way in the back. And he was there waiting for me with 2 of his friends, and they had sticks, and they proceeded to just hit me and hit me and hit me with these sticks. Well, it was mostly him. The other 2 guys sort of did it once or twice, and they were like, okay, we're done here, right? And they ended up pulling him away. I came home and I was covered in welts all over, and my father was furious. He actually took me to the police station, and the police went, and when they talked to the other kids' families were like pissed and they were going to be punished and whatever. But when they went to the Smith house, all that happened was the dad asked the kid, did you do this? And he was like, oh no, I didn't do it. And he was like, well, my son says he didn't do it, so he didn't do it. And that was it. Now, I haven't seen any of these people, of course, in many, many years. The last I had heard of them, that same oldest son was doing time somewhere for something. I'm not exactly sure what. The oldest daughter had gotten into a very bad, abusive relationship with someone who broke her arms. So it's a sad story. It's not a pleasant story. It's a story, I think, if you talk to people, a lot of people have similar stories. And I'm not telling it because I want people to feel bad for me. This happened a long time ago, and I'm over it. And it is what it is. It's just like a memory that doesn't really have an effect on me anymore. The reason I'm talking about this is to set up what I'm trying to get across here in the first place. And also, I think that a lot of people don't understand that when we talk about these issues, we're talking about something that connects with people and their lives and their stories and has had a lot of impact on individual people. So you should be aware that in this conversation, I'm not going to dither around. I'm not going to indulge silly whataboutisms or nonsense like that. We don't have time for any of that shit anymore. 3 women are murdered every day in my country. 1 in 4 women has been harassed at work. 1 in 6 have been raped. 98% of mass shooters are men, and they are overwhelmingly abusers, and their targets often include women that they have abused and their families. Even among those men who would never hurt women in these ways, and that is the majority of men. The majority of men would not and do not do these things. But there's still a tendency there to enable or excuse them in various ways. On the one hand, women are constantly policed against showing anger to men or blaming men or making it seem like men are the problem or you hate men. Like, this is the stuff you hear all the time. But at the same time, you hear these same dudes saying stuff like this.
Steve Wynn's your next door neighbor. Allegations will not end. This witch hunt will only slow down when court system and lawmakers start setting ground rules for adult women time frame for accusations. Fear should not be the cry when the police job is to serve and protect. #MeToo.
This is scary times we are living in. Not because we can be blown up by a suicide bomber or another 9/11. That's scary. But the fact we are equally afraid of losing a job, being sued, or assault charges because of a failed attempt to flirt. If something we say is found to be offensive by the listener, and the listener's audience outnumbers the individual when it comes down to a court case, you're just out of luck, innocent attempt or not. It appears that as long as you are deemed favorable, then the advance is okay. Really? So it comes down to the subjectivity of the specific woman on that day? Don't we call that a mood swing? Hormones? And yet this is what is dictating how we behave? Female hormones? Society has been led down this road by feminism, Marxist thinking, leading basically to a collectivist, communistic new order of social behavior. We are being told how to act, what to say, and now that we are wrong for what we think, people, there is a big problem here.
This is the world #MeToo was inadvertently begging for. A world where Mike Pence's rule of not dining with women who aren't his wife is the most sensible rule men can adopt. A world in which men and women sit in different sections of flights and trains. Brackets see Japan. What a nerd.
Now, putting aside that is extortion, plain and simple, wait, no, let me start over. While definitely not putting aside that is extortion, I would like you to consider what the reaction would be if women started talking about engaging in illegal discrimination against men in order to protect themselves against rape or harassment. So that's one double standard that I see all the time. We're talking about the far more likely scenario of a woman being harassed, stalked, or assaulted than the very rare one of a man's life being destroyed by a false allegation of any of those. Somehow, it's still not okay for a woman to take any discriminatory moves regarding men or have feelings about men because #not all men. But the reverse is, well, maybe not great, but it's understandable and women should have known better. It's really all their own fault. All right, so now for any of you who are right now getting your dander up, getting a little tense out there, I can feel it. I think it's time that we consult the experts.
Well, hello. My name is Dr. Whiteman Fragility, and I am a big fancy expert on many things that need expertness. Here at the Fragility Institute, we want to help men, respond to their concerns, and answer their questions. And today I want to answer some of the most common questions about toxic masculinity here at this institute, which totally exists. Now, I will start by saying that toxic masculinity does not mean that all masculinity is inherently toxic. There are just simply toxic elements to masculinity that we want to address and avoid. So for the sake of not having an argument about how adjectives work, I think it's important that I get that out of the way. Now, you might want to take a nice deep breath in because you are going to feel a slight pinch.
Let's do it. Yeah. Alrighty. Good, good, good. All right. Why do we have to call it toxic masculinity? If it's something anybody might do, why not just call it being an arsehole? Why relate it to masculinity at all?
The term masculine is a neutral one. Masculine traits can be both toxic and beneficial, but when you want to solve a problem, it's important to accurately identify what that problem is. Say you have a kid who's doing poorly in school. You might think that it's because they're lazy, but it could turn out that it's actually because they have a learning disorder. Just like all kids who do poorly in school aren't lazy necessarily, every act of assholery doesn't necessarily have to do with toxic masculinity. Being lazy and being an asshole are surface level, while having a learning disorder or being toxically masculine is a deeper issue. And now that you know that, you should probably go get Timmy some meds or else you're a terrible parent. Many pervasive social problems relate to our culturally ingrained ideas about who we are and what it means to be a real man. This can be toxic. The pressures that we put men under to never deviate from this impossible standard causes incredible pain and difficulty for all of us.
Yes. Well, can women have toxic masculinity?
Yes. One would be that a woman would want to show that she's just as competitive or as tough as a man might be. Or another would be that a woman would shame a man for not being as masculine as her cultural upbringing suggests that he should be.
Huh. Huh. Well, is there a toxic femininity? Huh?
Well, there can be. Femininity, again, is a neutral term. There can be toxic and beneficial aspects to it as well. And really, we can call things whatever we want, but this kind of deviates from the whole point and distracts from the issue. When we're talking about feminine gender roles, we're talking about aspects that inherently obstruct a woman from having agency, capacity, or the ability to change things in their world, whereas a man is expected to not only have agency over themselves, but to ideally dominate and control and compete with others. Men are supposed to take what they want, while women are supposed to be the ones who are taken. And meanwhile, LGBT people are considered aberrant and deserved of mockery, suspicion, and abuse. And that's kind of the whole fucking problem. This urge to find some sort of toxic femininity which often seems to be an almost childish desire for fairness. My dear dudes, nothing about this is fair. It's not fair for the women, it's not fair for the men, it's not fair for anyone. And if you spend time dithering about while women gossip, so that might be mean, rather than dealing with the actual issue, then you are part of the problem.
Can you just admit that you hate men and think they're inherently evil and to blame for everything?
On the contrary, the whole reason we bring this up is to a large degree we believe that this is not inherent, or at least not inherent in any way that makes it impossible not to change. Otherwise, trying to say that we should change cultural norms would be completely pointless. Really, we should be looking at the ones who say that this is just how things are and that none of us have the ability to change or to stop the inherently violent, cruel, and dominating tendencies of toxic masculinity.
Shouldn't we focus on the economic issues? It's just a distraction, right?
The most popular religions and ideologies all over the world demand to have a man at the head of the household. The most popular figures we have in all forms of media happen to be men that are violent or aggressive. Leadership all over the planet has adhered to toxic ideas of violence and misogyny. So-called alphas dominate with the idea that only the strong will survive. Instead of working together, we embrace the ideas of selfishness, greed, and dominance over the unlucky or the unprivileged, allowing for the justification of laissez-faire capitalism, the class struggle, and even slavery. The urge we have to fuck and kill everything has brought this planet to the brink of destruction. Oh no. We will not be focusing on just one single cog any further in this machine. It is all interconnected, and as climate change advances, populations displace, and fascism spreads all across the world, we can't afford half measures any further. We need to attack this machine every side at once, and we need to bring this whole thing down.
Thank you, Doctor and random alpha male. So now I've come to the end of what I have to say. I wanted to do a couple notes on things I learned while putting this video together. As you can tell, I asked a lot of men to help me out and do various things, and I gave them a little direction, but I left it pretty open, and it was interesting to me to see the differences in my sort of suggestions and what they came up with. So one example, and I don't think he'll mind me saying this, was Deadhead Animation, whose channel you should check out, and he played Dr. Fragility. And yes, I know it's on the nose. We're not going subtle around here. Just deal with it. The part before he goes into the Q&A, my suggestion for the joke there was to start off with an exaggerated, caring, oh, poor bunny, it's okay, something along those lines. And of course, he went in the exact opposite direction with the glove, and this is going to pinch. It obviously speaks to our socialization differences, and also, in terms of humor, I have noticed for sure, sorry, now I'm having real trouble with my conversation. I have definitely noticed that there is a double standard even among the left, like for what men can get away with and what women can get away with. If you're looking at Chapo Trap House or Michael Brooks or Kevin Logan, it's not that they don't get any pushback, but it's just not the same as what women get. They get pushback to what I just wouldn't get away with, period. And I know that, and I'm all right with that. I think it's worth pointing out, because I also have sort of a weird sense of humor sometimes, but I keep it tamped down in these videos because I know I don't have the same amount of space. The other thing that I found while I was making this video, like I said, I had originally asked men, specifically cis men or trans men, but men. I wanted men to process these ideas and men to be involved in this. And it seems like a lot of times men don't like to be a part of this conversation if they can possibly help it. And more men need to be involved in it. But I soon found that I had made a mistake and began to ask genderqueer and non-binary people to sort of jump in as well. Because as I was talking to people, it became very clear to me that they had a lot of really valuable, interesting, salient input here that needed to be presented as well, that needed to be honored. So that's what I learned. And now that I'm coming to the end of what I've had to say, all this talk about different models of masculinity made me wonder what people might think more positive models would look like. The last part of this video doesn't really come from me, except that I assembled it. I had gone on Twitter and started out again by asking men, but ended up with a lot of input from other people. So I just asked them to send me things on Twitter, and I got a really great response and a really broad response. It wasn't just my usual people that happened to follow me. It was people I've never heard of. So I'm going to show them without judgment, without endorsement, without criticism. I left it wide open, said just tell me what you think and I'll put it out there. And I think you'll be really interested in what people had to say. And I got some music to go with it from some awesome musicians whom I love. Thank you. And the only thing I think it's important to mention before we start is that there's a large number of men who felt that there was nothing to be gained from continuing with any preconceived notions or definitions of masculinity or femininity. Having these labels was limiting and prescriptive and amounted to indulging in false standards that separated people unnecessarily. And this is a valid position. It should be considered. It should be honored. I can see why a lot of people would think this way. It should very much be a part of the discussion. It just doesn't fit with the rest of the thing. So I'm just saying that up front. But now, without further ado, for those who want to examine some other ideas,
let me go. I don't wanna be your hero. I don't wanna be a big man. I just wanna fight like everyone else. You masquerade. I don't wanna be a part of your parade. Everyone deserves a chance to walk with everyone else while holding down a job to keep my girl around. Maybe buy some new strings and her a night out on the weekend. We can whisper things, secrets from my American dreams. Baby needs some protection, but I'm a kid like everyone else. So let me go. I don't wanna be your hero. I don't wanna be a big man. I just wanna fight like everyone else. Yeah, ooh, ooh, So let me go. I don't wanna be your hero. I don't wanna be a big man. I just wanna fight like everyone else. Your masquerade. I don't wanna be a part of your parade. Everyone deserves a chance to like everyone else. Let me go. I don't wanna be your hero. I don't wanna be a big man. I just wanna fight like everyone else.
But disappear.